morning, everybody. So first session of the day, we're going to jump right in and get started. I don't know about you, but for one of this is my first day teaching, so it took me a while to find this room. So there may be people that come in a little late, so if that happens, I'll just stop whatever I'm doing and say, and that's the most important thing you'll learn this morning. And if you could all cheer wildly, no, that would be really mean. I've always thought that would be. So I've told that joke way too many times, I realized, because a little while ago I was in a hall where the door to come in was like right there. So if you came in late, everyone knew. So I'd made that joke about if you come in late, and this person came in, sure enough, 10 minutes late, and I kind of glanced over and I looked up and the whole room was going. And I was like, what? And someone actually said, so Dave, would that be the most important thing we'll learn today? I was like, no, not really. And they're all like, oh. And I was like, oh, I get it. Too late. Your own joke comes back to bite you. So I thought for this session it would be appropriate to have a short little intro just to kind of set the tone. So I just arbitrarily made up a little design here for this intro. That's enough of that. So this session is called Breaking Bad Photoshop Habits, and my concept here is we are by nature usually creatures of habit. So when you learn how to do something in Photoshop, you kind of do it that way and just keep doing that way because that's the way you've figured it out. Let me ask this question. How many people here would say they're mostly self-taught in Photoshop? I see a lot of hands. And I realized many years ago the problem with being self-taught is the teacher. Because if you don't know how to do it, how do you teach yourself that? So really when people say they're self-taught, they're like, well, I was trying to do this thing, and I kind of tried something, and it worked, so I thought, I'll just do it that way, I guess, because it worked. So we tend to use those habits because it's just the way we learned. And my goal today is to show you lots of little ideas of different ways, so it's really about efficiency. Bad habits, to me, usually mean you're doing things the long way, or a way that's not very flexible, so you can't reuse your design or repurpose it or figure out how you did it, all that kind of stuff. So really, that was just a catchy name to say how to be more efficient in Photoshop. So I'm going to kind of go through a bunch of things that I've seen people do that I would say are not really the ideal way of doing things. And the first one is just kind of jumping into something without thinking about it. So you go to use a tool and you wonder why it doesn't work. So, for example, I take my brush tool and I'm getting I like to call this the I'm sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that symbol. And you have to kind of figure it out, and sometimes, like in this case, the error message actually tells you the problem is that, oh, I had a blank layer, but it was hidden. Now, other times, the message that you get won't really be that helpful. So my suggestion, a better habit, is to use what I consider a checklist. And I started doing this years ago when I started teaching Photoshop because I thought the last thing I want is to go and demonstrate something and have it not work. So I was kind of in my head going, okay, I've got the brush tool, I got to make sure the layer is showing, I got to set my options for the brush tool. I would sort of go through this little mental checklist, and I realized I should be saying that out loud, not just to myself, because it really is a good way to work. So I suggest as a habit, a good habit, as soon as you activate a tool, you should look at the options bar. Because Photoshop has a very long history. It remembers the last way you used that tool. So if you last used the brush tool 3 weeks ago and it was set in overlay mode at 10% opacity, it probably still is. And at the time that might have made perfect sense, but now it doesn't. So one of my first steps was always this little mental checklist that just checks things and makes sure everything's ready to go. Another part of that checklist would be to do with layers. Am I on the right layer? Is the layer visible? Should I add a new layer? And the answer to a lot of these questions is it depends. Depends on what you're trying to do. But at least to go through that thought process will help you kind of remember, okay, no wonder that isn't working. And I found once I started doing that, I spent more time doing and less time undoing. Because often what happens is, oh, that didn't work, undo that, and it's often just because of some shortcut or something you forgot to do. You forgot to check this, or you forgot to set up a new layer, or whatever it might be. The other one that I think is really important, how many people here like to use keyboard shortcuts? That's about average. That's actually a little, I think the average is usually about 47%. That looked like about 48 to me. I love keyboard shortcuts mostly because I'm lazy. If I can avoid having to move my mouse to places, then I would do that. Now, for people that didn't put their hand up, they're one of those people, oh, you know, keyboard shortcuts, it's hard to remember. And, you know, it shouldn't be, because as we all know, if anyone uses multiple Adobe products, they all share exactly the same keyboard shortcuts. Sort of, some of the time. But one of the ways, the simplest way to get in the habit of using keyboard shortcuts is if you are one of those people that goes and clicks on the tool you want to use in Photoshop, stop doing that. Every tool in Photoshop, you just tap a single letter. So it's the easiest shortcut to remember, because it's not like Command, Option, Shift this, or Alt, Control, whatever. It's just a letter. And most of them are quite logical, like M for marquee, C for crop, T for type, L for lasso, things like that. Others are a bit more of a stretch, like W for magic wand. Or quick selection is W because it shares the same slot as the magic wand. Others like I for eyedropper. Okay, I can kind of see that one. And then there's other tools that just make no sense whatsoever. One of my favorite things, my favorite Photoshop teaching stories, this happened to me years ago, but I've told the story a zillion times because it still makes me laugh, but it's also a kind of interesting way to remember. I was teaching years ago in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was talking about this very topic of, you know, clicking on or just tapping a letter for the tools. And I was going through the different tools, and I said, now there's tools like the healing brush is the letter J. How would you ever remember that? And someone from the back of the room said, just think, Jesus, I'm healed. And I was like, all right, I'll never forget in my life that it's J for the healing brush, because how could you? So fast forward a few years later, I was at, I think it might have been at Max a few years ago, and someone came up and said, I was using the Jesus brush. And I'm like, okay, it's not actually called the Jesus brush. That's just kind of a way to help you remember, because people might be a little, you know, I was using the Jesus brush. Like, oh, really? Okay. So, for example, I'm right up here. You can see where my cursor is in the very top right-hand corner. And I want to temporarily switch to a different tool. Instead of going all the way over and clicking on the toolbox, I just tap L for lasso, B for brush, V for move, and so on. And basically what it's doing is just eliminating the need for you to go back and forth to the toolbox. Now what happens is when you press a letter, like I tap the letter L for lasso, it will activate whatever last lasso you used from the set of 3. So the only time you have to remember any other keys is if it's the wrong one. So if I wanted the polygonal lasso tool, then it's Shift L. Every time you press that, it will toggle through the various tools that share the same slot. So that's just a simple way of getting into the world of keyboard shortcuts. The other way I think is really important is there are lots of things in Photoshop that don't have a keyboard shortcut that I think should. And what happens is someone's job in the Photoshop team is to allocate keyboard shortcuts. And that's fine, they did that. But there are some things they gave a keyboard shortcut to that personally, I would never use that function. There's other functions that don't have a keyboard shortcut that should. For example, I use layer masks all the time. And I got tired of moving my mouse down and clicking on the Add Layer Mask button. I thought there should be a keyboard shortcut for this. And thankfully, you can. You can edit the keyboard shortcuts. Go under Edit, to Keyboard Shortcuts. You can edit the shortcuts for the main application menus, the individual panel pop-up menus, as well as the individual tools. So for example, in this case, I would go to Layer, and then scroll down to eventually where I see Layer Mask. Now the challenging part, I'll tell you right now, is you're not going to find a shortcut that's available. You have to reallocate one from somewhere else, because all the shortcuts are basically taken. So what you have to do is make a decision of what am I okay with giving up on one function to apply to this other function. So I'm going to say I'm going to use a Command-Shift-L or Control-Shift-L as with the shortcut that I want to use. When I do, it comes up and says, this is already in use and will be removed from Auto-Tone. Well, I have never in my life clicked on Auto-Tone, nor will I ever. So I'm like, sure, I'm going to accept that. Now, if you typed in a shortcut and it came up and said, this is already used by paste, you know, you might not want to use that. But look at it from a perspective of how often do I use it? So I just say, okay, fine. Now if I want a layer mask, instead of going and clicking on the button, I just press that shortcut and it's there. So for me, that's just something every day that saves me time of having to go and click on it. And what I realized is when it talked about auto tone, I said, well, there's also auto contrast, maybe auto color. And I went through and I found at least, I would say, gosh, 7 to 10 keyboard shortcuts that I either never use, or it's a function like I use liquify now and then, but maybe I could find a shortcut for that. Vanishing point I use very rarely. So you can sort of go through and start to see other keyboard shortcuts that you can apply. And the nice thing is, like most things in Photoshop, once you do this, it stays that way until you change it. Okay? So I don't have to do anything. It will always be that shortcut unless I choose to revert it. You can save your set of keyboard shortcuts, so if you have more than one machine, you can move them from one to the other, so you don't have to relearn everything. But I really believe that keyboard shortcuts are a great time saver, and it's a much easier to remember shortcuts you have allocated than trying to remember ones that were made for you. So that's just an idea. Now, I'm going to deny I ever said this, but if you have anyone in your office you really find is becoming a pain, just go in and edit all their keyboard shortcuts to something. No, don't ever do that. That would be terrible, terrible, and yeah, we don't want to do that at all. Okay. Although on April Fool's, it would be pretty funny. All right, so the other example of, talked before about that checklist idea of tapping a tool, the letter for the tool, and then looking at the options bar. There's a lot of tools where we're constantly having to go and change the settings. So for example, if I go to the type tool, of course, there's all the type settings, or the crop tool, whatever it is, having to go in and enter all those values. There's always something that we have to concern also with. The clone stamp tool, whether it's this mode or that mode. So let's go back to the type tool for a second. One of the things that we can do to make our life simpler is to make presets. Presets for every tool. They're actually ironically called tool presets. And what it means is, instead of tapping on that letter to get the tool and then entering all the information, you do that once and you save it as a preset. The presets are found here. If you look on the right beside the letter T, there's a little down pointing triangle, and there's all the tool presets for everything. I'm going to switch it to current tool only, little checkbox at the bottom. So now I'm seeing just the presets that I have created for this tool. Now I should pause and say, there are tool presets that come with Photoshop built in. I personally believe that one of the reasons some people don't use tool presets is based on some of the ones that are already there. For example, there is a preset that comes with Photoshop called Fill with Bubbles pattern, which is awesome because I like to fill with bubbles pattern almost daily. So it's great that there's already a preset for that. So anyway, as we'll talk about, you can remove presets you don't want. But what it means is now I can say, all right, personally I like to add some text in here just so I can see it, and it tells me if I'm in the right ballpark or not. So then let's just pick something different. We'll do something crazy just so you can, okay, that was weird. But anyway, we'll do that. So you end up with it looking the way you want, and then you go to this pop-down menu and you use the standard symbol in Adobe for anything new, so New Tool Preset. Don't call it Horizontal Type Tool 1. That would be of no help. Call it like Horizontal Type Tool 3. That would be much better. Now, for some reason, it always defaults to Horizontal Type Tool X or Crop Tool. Well, look at the preset menu. And you know it's a Type Tool preset. It's got a big letter T beside it. So I would call it something like, you know, the name of the font, and if I could type, and the size. I use codes like align center, white, whatever it is, and click OK. So now, if I put this back to something, not that, doesn't really matter, but I'll just change some settings here. So you can see I've got everything changed. Now, here's the key to this. Preset, the term preset comes from the Latin pre, which means use it before you click with the tool. So you can't type text and then say, oh wait, that's wrong, let me switch to the preset. That just means now the settings are changed for the next time you use that tool. So you have to get in the habit of saying, oh wait, before I start typing, let me go and find that preset I created. Now everything changes and it's done. So if you have to add a series of styles of type, you just click on your preset and apply it. And the great thing about presets like this is it adds no overhead to Photoshop. They're just little tiny files that really don't do anything in terms of file size or overhead or anything like that. So you can create tool presets for almost every tool. So one of the ways you can use this is kind of interesting. So here on my options bar, I have it set to current tool only. I'm seeing just the type tool. So right now I'm on the type tool, as you can see. There's also a panel called tool presets. And in here, now if it was up to me, I would have this work a little differently, because you see this also has a current tool only checkbox. On this one, I like to turn it off. Unfortunately, when you do that, it also turns it off on the other one up in the options bar. And the reason I do this is this actually becomes a really interesting way to switch tools. So right now I have the type tool active. What if I wanted to switch to the crop tool with a particular setting? Well, instead of tapping C for crop and then clicking on the tool preset, I just click on the preset here and it switches to that tool with the preset already applied. So it's actually a really interesting way, if you've created a bunch of these tool presets, to switch between tools on the fly, knowing that you already have the preset applied. Just know that when you do that in this panel, now it means when you go back to this preset panel, it also is showing everything. So on my little list for Adobe of little tiny things I wish you would change, I would love it if these little checkboxes were independent of each other, but they're not. But it's a real time saver, because instead of me trying to remember, 4 different settings that I use for the clone stamp tool, whatever, I just use my tool presets. Oh, by the way, I would suggest that a good habit, if you're going to get into the world of tool presets, is to make a preset for kind of like normal. So for example, the clone stamp tool, I have ones for like darken and lighten and this opacity. I would also make one where it's normal blend mode, 100% opacity. So you can kind of reset it back to square one for any tool using. So that's a good habit to get into. All of these presets are found and managed under the preset manager. So here's all, and I go to tools, here all the preset that I have available. So if there are presets in here, I think I've probably already deleted in a previous demonstration, fill with bubbles pattern, because it was not showing. So this is where you can delete ones. If you wanted to share all of your type tool presets with someone, you could go in here and choose Save Set, and then it will create a little file you can share. It's platform independent. Mac, PC, you can go back and forth. Very simple to use. So that's one type of preset that I use all the time. The other type of preset I use quite frequently is for adjustment layers. I'm a big fan of using adjustment layers versus the adjustments under the image menu. So let me talk about that briefly first, just in case you're not familiar with the difference. So this menu here, if it was up to me, if I was somehow in charge of Adobe for a day, I would change this to very destructive adjustments that you probably don't want to use, would be the name of this. It would make a much wider menu, but here's the problem. If I go into a command like levels and I say, let's pretend I was staring into the sun for a while, so my eyes were out of whack, or this big spotlight, so I'm like, there, it looks perfect. And I click OK. Now, if I did something else or closed the document and saved it, that would be my new document. Well, if I went back to levels and attempted to readjust it, here's another thing I would add. Right here would say, good luck. Because if you ever see a histogram that looks like that, it's like, yeah, you got nothing there. So thankfully, of course, I didn't actually save it. So instead, I use the adjustment layer version of levels. And it looks the same. But actually, a couple of things about it. First of all, it kind of gets out of your way a little easier. But the other thing that's really important to note, if you look in that levels panel for the adjustment layer, there's no OK button. So you never actually click OK to apply it. Adjustment layers, it's almost like they're in constant preview mode. So you just leave it. So when you close it down, now it's a separate layer that I can show and hide, but more importantly, I can go back and readjust it if I decide I don't really like the way this is looking. So as long as you save this as a PSD file, you can just continue to make these ongoing adjustments. So adjustment layers like this have some interesting possibilities from an efficiency standpoint. Let's say I was trying to make a selection, and someone sends you this photograph and say, hey, can you just select this? I love when people ask Photoshop questions and put the word just in it. Can you just select him? I'm like, well, if I could see where he was, then I probably could. Thank you for sending a white lab coat on a white wall that's terribly overexposed. That's fantastic. So one of the phrases I talk about all the time in Photoshop is end up with. Instead of just saying select this guy, I want to end up with him selected. So one of the things I could do is temporarily make an adjustment so it's easier to see where he is. Because if I can see the edges of his arms better, Photoshop tools probably can too. So I would add an adjustment layer, and it's crucially important that in this case you use an adjustment layer because we want it to be temporary. So you go in and you do something to crunch it all so it looks terrible, but oh look, now I can see where his shoulders and arms are, so now I could take a tool like the quick selection tool and make my selection. I'm not going to make a perfect selection just for the sake of time, but you get the idea that you would go through all that thing, make a really good selection, and then once you're finished, throw away, oops, sorry, wrong place, throw away the adjustment layer, okay? And we're just going to all pretend that it was a perfect selection. But you get the idea. The point is, the temporary nature of adjustment layer means you can do things like that. You can over-adjust. You can try things and make sure that you can see what you're doing. So now I can end up with a good selection in a way that was easier than me trying to just use it where you can't even see the edges of something. So that's just one example of the many reasons that adjustment layers are very useful. But back to our preset concept, there are many times in Photoshop where I open a photograph and I want to apply, say, curves. And I often start with the same type of curve. It won't mean that every photograph is going to have exactly the same adjustment, but they often start the same way. So if I go to curves, for example, so very often I found myself making like an S curve, something like that, and then maybe tweaking it a little further. Well, instead of doing that every time, oops, let me go put back for a second. What I could do instead is save a curves preset. So I've already done that. Just use that menu. So now if I was going to make that initial adjustment, I'd go to curves and pick from this preset menu and choose my S curve. Now, all it's done is it's added those points and moved them. It's not permanent, so the whole point of a preset in this case is to get you started. Now in this case I might tweak this or adjust that, or I might just leave it the way it is. But one of the very simple ways to use a preset like this is to get you started. So instead of every time going, add curves, click on some points, and I'm always ending up at roughly the same starting point, this way the starting point is done for you. Okay? Oh, by the way, one thing I just reminded myself that I forgot to mention when I was talking about keyboard shortcuts. I have, at the moment, my keyboard shortcuts are still like Command L for levels and Command M for curves. One of the things that you could do is reallocate that keyboard shortcut to open the adjustment layer version. So instead of having to go to the adjustment layer menu, in fact, I just turned that off for this demonstration, but I have that set up as one of my main shortcuts. So now I don't go to that pop-up menu to add a curves adjustment layer. I press Command or Control M. Instead of using the destructive curves, it brings up the adjustment layer version of curves. So that's just another way to take advantage of the presets and doing things ahead of time and using keyboard shortcuts to help you save time. So I have this logo, I don't know where it came from, but coincidentally. One of the things, and I used to be terrible at this, is having your logo somewhere and wanting to go and find it all the time. So I need to apply my logo, so you go and I think I put it in that folder. Oh, that's not the right one. So as soon as Creative Cloud Libraries came out, I'm like, why would I ever search for my logo again? So if you're ever one of those people that goes looking for where is my logo, stop it. Instead, take advantage of your Creative Cloud libraries. You can have multiples of them. And basically you just say, I'd like to add that logo. Let's just take my move tool and drag it right in there. And now it's built in. So now if I ever need my logo again for some project, you just drag it in. It comes in and it's, whoops, on keyboard shortcut. I'm still using Photoshop CC 2018, but I still have to hold down the Shift key, which is not going to be confusing at all for the first few weeks, at all. So there it is. Now I have my logo that accessible. So if you're not really leveraging Creative Cloud libraries, you should be, because it's a really wonderful way of having access to files without going and searching for them. If you happen to use programs like Illustrator, or InDesign, they share the same library, so you can take a logo in Illustrator and put it in your library and then drag it into Photoshop, so it's very easy to combine those kind of things. Alrighty. So just want to quickly mention that about the Creative Cloud library idea. So I want to talk about something that I'm going to assume, hopefully most of us are on the same page about this, but just in case. I like to do all of my work as non-destructively as possible. And by that I mean work in such a way that it's easy to go back and change my mind or do something different. And often when I talk to people about working non-destructively, one of their reactions is, well, I don't really change my mind that much. And I'm like, A, sure, but B, it's not just about changing your mind. How many of you have ever found yourself in this situation? So you're working away in Photoshop and you're on a roll and you're doing things and you're looking great, and then you save the file as a JPEG and you come back 6 months later and you go, how on earth did I do that? Because at that moment in time it made perfect sense because you were on a fly, on the roll, doing everything. I always save a PSD file, a master file, a layered file, so I can go back and look at it, not just to change my mind, to remind myself how I did it, to reuse some of the same information in a different document, to reverse engineer and figure out how I did it 6 months ago. So using layers is just the main part, but a big part of this whole working non-destructively. Another example of it is erasing is, to me, not a great idea. So if I grab my eraser tool on this layer, and let's just go to the regular eraser, using the right bracket key to make my brush bigger, and I got a nice soft edge brush. I'm like, yeah, it looks good, awesome. And I'm, working away, and I show someone, they're like, so I prefer to see part of her hand at the bottom there that you cut off, and you're like, well, it doesn't exist anymore because I have deleted it permanently. Obviously, I haven't in this case because I can undo, but the point is erasing is one of those very permanent steps. So instead, it would make better sense to add a layer mask or use the keyboard shortcut you made earlier, Dave, and take your paintbrush, make sure I go through my little checklist, everything's normal, okay, and start doing the same kind of thing. Looks like the same end result, but the difference is we're going to end up with this mask that, of course, we can edit later on if we don't like it, and that looks, not very great. But the point of it is I have this mask over here that I can go back and re-edit. I can hide it completely if I want. So it just gives me more options from a flexibility standpoint. So if you are in the habit of just saying, oh, I don't need those pixels, let me just delete them, select and delete or erase, yeah, that's okay, but for me, there's always this little voice in my head going, right now it might make sense to erase, but what about later on when you change your mind or you want to experiment, try something different, or you want to reuse that layer on a different photograph and you want all that information? That's one of those things where you just have to make that decision. And for me, it's an easy decision. I always add a layer mask. Now, I say always because it's easy to do that, but do I ever grab the eraser and just delete a little part? Maybe, rarely. But I'll tell you, I at least consider for a moment, should I use a layer mask, just in case? And I've had situations, I know I have, where I've added a layer mask and probably never gone back and re-edited it. But it's just sitting there, just in case. I know I can go back and easily adjust it. So the other thing that we can do, the good news about once you have a layer mask, is if you want to redo the same thing. So here I have this top layer and it's kind of covering up her because it's above. Well, here's a layer mask I made previously on this layer. One little tip, by the way, if you weren't aware, that if you ever want to view the actual mask, hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the mask so you can actually look at it and kind of see what it looks like. I'm going to, just for safety's sake, because I have a feeling this might be necessary, just add a little bit more to this mask, just on here. I'm just using keyboard shortcuts for like fill. So now what I want to do is on this top layer, I basically want to use the same mask. So instead of starting again, one of the very common shortcuts in Photoshop is the Option or Alt key is often a shortcut to add some enhancement. So if I were to just take this layer mask and drag it, I would be moving it to the other layer. If instead I hold down the Option or Alt key, it copies it. So now I'm able to copy it, and it looks perfect. Now she has a grassy face. So I need to invert the layer mask by pressing Command or Control I, but again, 2 steps instead of me starting over again, because I'm thinking, well, It's not exactly the same mask. Well, it is. It's just the opposite. It's just an inverted mask. So in Photoshop, one of the general tips that you should always be thinking of is if you're ever using a tool and you want to, or a function in Photoshop, and you want to enhance it or change the behavior, it's almost always the Option or Alt key. So as an example, if I just had some other layer, let's get rid of these other things for a moment, and I was using some filter, I don't know, let's just do something like this, and I was playing around with all kinds of settings and didn't like it, if you hold down the Option or Alt key, see how the cancel button is changing to reset. So instead of canceling and then reopening the same dialog box or panel, which many people do, Option or Alt will reset it. So that's just another example of where that Option or Alt key is going to change the behavior. Now, years ago, I had a student who, way back in the early days of Photoshop, when it actually still came with a manual, which is weird to think now, she had told me that she had got a version, she'd borrowed a copy of Photoshop from her coworker until her paid version arrived, so she didn't have a manual, so she didn't know the names of any of the tools, so she just made up names for them all, which was interesting. And so every time she asked a question, it was like, I'm using the, and she'd call her whatever she called the tool. And at one point she said, I was trying to do something. I was holding down the Make Better key, and I was like, what now? And she said, the Make Better, oh, that's what I call Option or Alt, because I realized that every time I did something in Photoshop, if I held down that key, it made it even better. And I was like, actually, that's pretty good. It's actually a pretty good way to remember. If you're trying to remember, now what key does what, the Option or Alt key is almost always the Make Better key. Okay, so that was just a simple statement to say, use masks. It's a good idea. So here's another typical habit that, and this is interesting to me because this is a habit that I actually used to suggest we do up until a few years ago. And that was, you're working away on something and you've got, in this case, I've got a bunch of type layers, and at a certain point, I want to, for example, maybe experiment with applying a filter to the type. Well, you can't apply a filter to type unless it's pixel-based, which we don't want to do. So that's not a good idea. So one of the techniques that we used to do, some people call it stamp visible, it basically makes a new layer, which is like a flattened version of everything, but still preserving all the layers below. Now, I'm not advocating you should do this, but I just want to show you the difference. It's the keyboard shortcut is the entire left side of your keyboard E. So Command Option Shift E, Control Alt Shift E makes a new layer on top. See how it has just like a little, if you look at it, it almost looks like a little flattened version with everything in it. But here's the problem with it. Now I could go ahead and do like filters or whatever, but if I decided, now that I look at it, I need to move the word love, well, I can't because that's just a picture. That's not actual type. So what I used to have to do when I used this method was delete that layer, move the word love, and then use the shortcut again. So the stamp visible idea has been used by people for many years, and in its day it was a pretty good one, but as long as you remember, it's literally a snapshot of that moment in time. So if anything has to change, you have to throw it away and do something else. So instead, I suggest we consider using something called a smart object. And I'm a big fan of smart objects because they're about the epitome of working non-destructively because they open up a whole world of possibilities. So let me just briefly explain what a smart object is in case you're unfamiliar. Basically, it's going to take one or more layers and in effect put them in a container, almost like a protective container. It's a magical protective container because it can do all kinds of things that Photoshop normally can't. So it's going to look like it's flattened, but as I'll show you, the content is still available. So the way it works in this case, I would take all of these layers. I just have the top layer selected. I'm going to shift-click on the bottom layer. And then somewhere in here, right-click and choose Convert to Smart Object. And it looks like I've flattened, but I haven't. And the way you can tell is there's a little symbol in the corner of the layer thumbnail. By the way, let me just get this out of the way now and say one of my favorite expressions to help people remember about being non-destructive is don't ever flatten. Flatten is Photoshop's F word. Okay? It's bad and you shouldn't do it. So let's just do some filter, whatever. Let's just do motion blur or something so you can see that I've done something crazy here. Okay. So I've done all that work, and now I still think, I still have to move the word love a little bit. Well, how do I do that? Because it's not there. It's not a separate layer anymore. Well, if we think that concept of a container, I need to look inside the container to look at its contents. And the way we do that with a smart object is you double-click on the layer thumbnail, and it's going to open a separate window with all the contents there. So this is the hardest part to get used to for new users of smart objects, is you're no longer always in the same window. You're going to be going back and forth between the contents window and, in effect, the container window. And by the way, don't look for something in Photoshop called container, because that's just my word for it. This is the contents, though, is what we're talking about, is edit the contents. So now I could tap V for my move tool, move this. I'm going to move it fairly dramatically so you can see where I put it. Now all I have to do is hit save, and when it finishes saving, you'll see it's updated in the other document. So this is the hardest part to get used to, is going back and forth, but gosh, it opens up a world of possibilities, because things we're used to run into roadblocks and say, well, I can't do that without merging or flattening. Now you don't have to. Like I said, it takes some getting used to go back and forth between the two windows, but once you do, gosh, like I said, there's just so many interesting possibilities. Part of what throws people off at first is which document am I in? So the way you can tell is the final document, your actual container document, if you will. You're going to just see what looks like one layer with that little symbol. The contents document will show you all the layers. And if you look at the very top where it says the file name, it's going to be based on whatever layer you happen to be on, or the layer at the top, but then .psb rather than PSD, that's always the name of the contents file. So if you ever find yourself kind of lost going, well, wait a minute now, where am I? Which one is which? That's how you can tell. So anything you do in here, this is a standard layer document. So I could add adjustment layers, I could add another layer, I could do layer styles. Anything I want to do, I can do it in here, hit save, and it will update over here. What you need to remember, though, is, again, in a sense, it's like this information really isn't here. So if I'm trying to paint on it or clone or heal or whatever, I'm going to get that symbol saying, no, you can't. Because technically, now they're protected. If I want to do any kind of editing, I have to either go to my contents window or, in this document, add a new layer and do some work this way, paint on here, whatever it might be. Okay? So that's the part, again, that takes a little bit of getting used to. Please don't ever listen to this dialog box. The smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Edit contents will no longer be available. And then it's like, rasterize smart object? And it's actually prompting you to click OK. There should be a button that says, no way, man, or something, because that would defeat the whole purpose. It would throw everything away. So if you ever see this, quickly cancel and say, oh, that's right, because I have to go to the contents window to edit it. Rasterize is almost as much of a bad word as flatten is, because once you rasterize, there's no going back. So let me take kind of a step back here and say a simple way to take advantage of a smart object is when you have a type layer and you want to add a filter to it. Apply some special effect. So I go to the filter menu, do something like motion blurs for the sake of argument. Now in this case, this dialog box is very smart. It actually says, would you like to rasterize or convert to a smart object? And it's actually prompting you to convert to a smart object. Yay! I can't tell you what, this popped up in a version of Photoshop a few years ago, and I was so happy because I've been for years telling people, don't pay attention to this dialog box. I'm like, oh, this one you can. So if I convert to smart object, I'll just show you, you could also go to the filter menu and choose convert for smart filters, which is exactly the same thing. And by that I mean when you take a layer and you convert it to a smart object, now any filter you apply is also smart. And a smart filter means this. Normally in the past, before smart filters, if you applied a filter, it would just be a one-shot deal. So here's what I would see people do all the time, and I shouldn't say see people, I was one of them. I would go to a filter, actually first of all I would duplicate the background layer, that's the way I used to do it, and then I'd go to a filter like blur, and I'd pick some number and I'd stare at it for a long time and go, because I knew once I clicked OK, I was kind of done. So now, oops, I've converted to a smart object. I can just go to my filter and do whatever I want in terms of blur, even to the point of maybe over blurring it, because now the filter actually shows up as part of the layers panel. That's what makes it smart, is it tells you, you used Gaussian blur. So maybe some of you had this same issue. Before smart filters, what I would have done when I duplicated the background layer is I'd apply a blur, but then there was no way to tell months later how much I blurred. This might sound crazy, but I just actually named the layer blur 37 just in case, right? Because that was the only way. But now, if you want to remind yourself how much the blur is, you just double click on it and it tells you, and you can change it one way or the other. And this little thing here is a mask for the smart filter. So if you decide that you want to do some special effect where only some areas are blurry, you can just mask it out. That was something that took a lot longer before, because you'd have to make a selection and then apply a filter and hope it looked good. The other part that's really interesting, and I love this part, this frankly has changed some of the filters I use. So there were some filters I never used before because frankly they just were kind of weird and didn't really, there were no options, it just kind of did it. If you look really closely here, you'll see beside where it says the name of the filter, which by the way I could just turn off as well, over to the right here there's another little symbol. If I double click on it, it brings up blending options for the filter. So what this does, it's almost like the filter's on its own layer, and you can change those type functions like lower the opacity. So now you're getting kind of a soft focus effect, or maybe change the blend mode so that the filter is being applied in a different way. So this is dramatically changing the impact of the way a filter looks, but yet it's still non-destructive. So you can try something. This is what I love about this non-destructive workflow. Photoshop by nature is a very linear program where you go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and you can step backwards in that order. This changes that completely, because now I can apply a smart filter, do 10 more steps, and then still go back to the smart filter and go, well, now that I look at it in context, maybe it needs to be different. So that's changing the rules of how we do things in Photoshop, because it, for the most part, takes away a lot of that. I have to be very careful of doing things in a very specific order, because things like smart filters and masks and things like that take away some of that and give me many more options. So anytime you're looking at smart filters, you can easily do it. You can add multiple filters to the same smart object. You will see them listed. So if I were to add another whatever filter, you will see that in my layers panel now it shows whatever filters I have applied. I can turn them individually on and off. The only kind of catch to it is if you have multiple smart filters added, there's only one mask. So you can't say, well, I like to mask the noise separately than the Gaussian blur. It doesn't work that way. That's just the reality, and I don't know that that will change anytime soon, just because the computing power apparently necessary to have multiple filters and masks would be quite challenging. So I would suggest to you that most of the time we want to use smart filters. The beauty of it, unlike that message that was saying in order to proceed you have to rasterize your type, is, as we saw earlier, this is still that container. So now if I look at it and say, well, now that I've applied those filters, I want to change something about the type, I still can, because it's still a type layer. So I can go in and pick a different typeface, whatever I want. All I have to do is close and save it, and it's going to update on your other document. So just one little note about the world of smart objects and smart filters is, in a sense, although it's not technically called this, when you start using smart objects and smart filters, in a way, it's almost like you're making a template. Because if this, for example, was something that I had to use for signage and had to change on a regular basis, now it's ready to go. I've already got the look that I want. All I have to do is double-click, change it to March or April or May or whatever, hit save, and it's done. So I'm not starting again. I'm not trying to go, how did I do that? What font was it? It's already there. Now, there's really no such thing at the moment of saving it as a template. If you save it as a PSD file, in a sense, it's like a template, because you can just open it, change the smart object, in this case the type, to a different word, save as a different one, and move on from there. Okay, so lots of great possibilities, and I'm really just barely touching the surface of smart objects. So if you have a device with you that takes photos, you might want to take a photo of this. I have on my training site a class on smart objects, and I feel it's such an important function that everyone should learn about it. So normally it's going to sound like an advertising, normally $59, but today for you as Max attendees, it's free. All you'll have to do, my training site has a login feature, so you have to create a login account, but then you'll be able to access this course for free. Please don't go there right now because I have to turn something on that I forgot to do this morning. So give it a little while, but do this later on, and you can. It's a multi-lesson, in-depth course about smart objects because I think it's so important that I want to make sure you really understand it more than just that little brief overview that I did. Everyone get that? Okay. Okay. Moving on. So there are times where I see people struggle to make selections, and there are times in Photoshop where making a selection is unnecessary depending on what you're trying to do next. So one of the things that I realized many years ago is that, and this is going to sound really strange to say this, but there's actually only two possible answers to every single Photoshop question, which is hard to believe, but it's true. So the two answers are theoretically and it depends. So if someone says, can you do that in Photoshop? You say, theoretically. How? Well, it depends. And you walk away very quickly. But so in this case, do I need to make a selection? Well, it depends. What are you trying to do? So I had this case where someone had a logo like this, and they said, my client sent me the logo. All I want to do is change everything black to red. So they were going through this very complicated, well, I went to select color range and I moved this slider, and I said, so wait, you're just trying to change the black to red? I said, yes. I said, why wouldn't you just use the fill command? And they went, I don't know. So let me, first of all, get a red color. So the fill command, I use the keyboard shortcut Shift-Delete or Shift-Backspace. They said, well, if I use the fill command, how's that going to help me? I was like, well, it's because you need to change one little thing. There's a blend mode in here called Lighten. Now, many, many moons ago in Photoshop, this mode used to be called Lighten Only, which is a good way to think of it. Because what that means is now the red can only fill colors that it can lighten. Well, red can't lighten white because it's not possible. You can't lighten white. You can certainly lighten black. So just like that, now I have the red logo I want. Didn't make a selection, didn't do anything else. So that's one of those things where once you dig down a little bit and realize what does that really mean, that blend mode, how is it working, that there are many situations where you can just do that without having to go to all the trouble, especially for something like this has little fine detail in it. I know there's no stray pixels I didn't get because Photoshop did all the work for me by lightening the black pixels with red. So that's just example one of don't make a selection if you don't need to. Here's my old car, the old PT Cruiser. And I wish to see what this would look like if I gave it a paint job to change the color. Now, making a selection of a car like this could take some time, so just give me about 20 minutes with the pen tool. I'll be right back. Another example where this is an interesting option if, and this is an important if, the color you're trying to change is unique to the object. In other words, the car is red, but there's not a lot of red colors anywhere else. If there was another red car right behind it or something, it would be harder. But what you do is you add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and then just to show you it doesn't matter, I'm going to pick yellows. And then there's little eyedroppers in here, and if I click on the eyedropper, with the eyedrop, should say, and then hold down the Shift key, and I'm just clicking in kind of different areas of red, different shades, and then as I start to move it, you'll see it just changes the color, so I can say, I think I like that blue color, maybe not quite so saturated, something like that. And then all you have to do is realize that there are other things. Okay, so it basically painted the light because the light was red, so I just have to paint on the mask that was already there with my adjustment layer and this flower in the back, and there's probably some lines here. So, but again, compared to the alternative of me spending a lot of time making a selection, one of the things that I always talk about from an efficiency standpoint is you need, in my mind, I'm always thinking, well, compared to the alternative, this is still faster. Is it perfect yet? Maybe not quite. I can still tweak it a bit, but gosh, it's a lot faster than me going in and making a selection and filling it and all that stuff. So anytime you can look at things like this, it's just going to be a lot easier to do things in a way that don't require you to do that extra step. The thing to remember with something like this, again, is it's kind of a global thing. You can see very quickly if it's going to work or not. I would still try it first in many cases, because if it comes even close to working, again, it's still going to save you time in the long run. Okay. So let's go back to this one for a second. I'm going to combine images that make no visual sense because I didn't think about this, but that's okay. One of these cases where your client says, oh, I'll send you my logo, and you're like, oh, great. And they send you a JPEG file. It's on a white background. You're like, fantastic. That's so helpful. Thank you so much. And they say, well, just remove the white. And you're like, okay. Now, depending on the situation, in this case, maybe just changing the blend mode to multiply might work okay. But just in case, sometimes it doesn't work as well. In fact, let me take a step back here. Delete this for a second, because let's put this back to red the way we had it. I think it'll be easier to see. Okay. All right. By the way, I haven't mentioned this out loud, but you may have noticed I'm dragging and dropping between documents instead of copying and pasting, because it's a little more RAM efficient to do it that way. So here, if I change the blend mode to multiply, the problem is you can see even the red parts of the logo are multiplying. So it's removing the white, but now it's also making it so that the red is kind of blending in, so that's probably not the best idea. So there's a function in Photoshop that's been around forever, but it's kind of hidden away if you've never seen it. I just double-clicked on the layer to get to the layer style panel, but I didn't add a particular layer style like, drop shadow, whatever. There are these sliders at the bottom called blend if, this layer and underlying layer. So there's sliders on each end. So if I say I want to make the white transparent, as I start to move the slider in, you'll see it's starting to make all the white transparent. Now, if I go too far, you'll see that the little red lines start to disappear. So I have to try and find a happy medium here. There's sometimes a little bit of white left over, so if you hold down the Make Better key, Option or Alt, you can split the triangle, and often that will create this nice little transitional zone for you. So for many situations where you're trying to make the white transparent, the blend if sliders is a very interesting way to do it. The one thing we have to be aware of, it's a little hard to see here, but maybe you can see if I zoom in. It's kind of tired. The white box technically is still there. So let me do it this way so you can see it. If I were to add, for example, a drop shadow, you'll see the drop shadow thinks that the box is still there. So if you've used the blend if sliders to make the white transparent, the way that you make it permanent is you add a new layer below. And the way we do that, normally when you click the new layer button, it puts the layer above your current layer. If you hold down the Command or Control key, it puts the layer below. Then you take this layer, and it's one of the rare times you'll hear me use the word merge. Merge down, Command or Control E. Now it's permanent. And now if I add the drop shadow, you'll see it's adding it to the entire thing. Now, the thing you need to know about blend if sliders is it's global. So you can't say, take just this white object and make the background see-through. If there's other things that are white, they will also have the same thing happen. So that's just an example where I would still try it, because if you get close, you can still work around it. Sometimes, like in our other logo here, as I look at it, I can see there are areas in here that are pretty close to white. So what I would probably do is take a selection tool like my elliptical selection and duplicate that onto its own layer. And now if I do the blend if sliders, he said, thank you. I should have thought about his shoes as well, but you get the idea where you can basically separate onto its own layer the parts you don't want to have a transparent background. So again, it's kind of a way of fooling it to end up with the look that you want of something with a transparent background. The blend of sliders will not always work, so we need to just know that sometimes that will not be the case. It will not work the way you want, but for lots of situations, it's a great place to start. It's very fast. You'll know almost immediately if it's going to work or not. So here's another example of something that it's a bad habit that I for years did, and I finally one day stopped doing it. And that was I wanted to fill a layer with color, so I would go to my color picker, choose the color, and then fill it on the layer below. And then if I wanted to choose a different color, I'd go back to the color picker and try a different color and fill it again. And while that worked, it really is not the most efficient way to work, considering there is an adjustment layer called solid color. So I would take that layer and put it below, and now if you want to try something else, you have a live version. So instead of going and picking a color, fill, okay, pick a different color, fill. A very useful adjustment layer is the fill solid color. Some people call it a fill color layer, and it basically allows you on the fly to be able to do this kind of thing where you can pick a color, anything you want, and again, of course, because it's an adjustment layer, it's always editable, so even later on you can come back and try a different number. If you're working on something where you need to copy a color, I used to, it's funny to think about this now. I mean, it seems obvious now, I think about it, but I wanted to copy a color, so here's what I used to do. I'd look at these numbers and I go, 150, 150, 132, 150, 150, 150, and I'd say it like 20 times, or I'd try and find a post-it note, try it down. Then I realized one day, this little hexadecimal code here is just a field. You just go copy, and then go to whatever you want to fill with something, go back to your color picker, and choose paste, and then you've got that color there. So instead of trying to remember all the values, just copy and paste the hexadecimal color, and you're good to go. Much easier. Okay, how are we doing here with, good, we're good. Okay. Let's see here. Oh, I want to show you this. Here's another example of the beauty of the blend if sliders. I want to do a special effect with this type to make it look like it's a little more weathered and on the brick wall. And in the past, I would have done all these steps, and I probably along the way years ago would have ended up rasterizing the type to apply a filter or something. Now, I just double click and go to the blend if sliders, and along with this layer, which if I did this, you're going to see it's just going to basically go away. You take the underlying layer and say, let me take some of the dark areas from the brick and start to push it through like that. Maybe split the triangles. We get this really nice kind of weathered on the brick look. However, it's still just a regular editable type layer. So any need to go in and say, well, I need to apply this or rasterize that, I could at this point still make it a smart object and apply a smart filter and kind of pile these things on top of each other. But I'm always trying to look at ways where, how can I do this where I don't have to start over again? So one of the things that I also want to mention here is, you've seen me a couple times go to the layer style dialog box, right, for things like drop shadow, things of that nature. There's the ability, we'll come back to this document in a moment, I want to show you over here first. Nope. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that I applied a color overlay to this layer. And I really liked the way it looked, and I thought, oh, I should have done to the other layers. There is the possibility of going here and choosing, oops, click on the right place, copy layer style, and then go to another layer and choose paste layer style. Paste layer style, okay. Apparently not in this case, okay. Where is it? Oh, there it is. I just didn't go far enough. Now that's okay. I'll show you another better way in a moment. But part of what I wanted to say here is that command, copy layer style, paste layer style, if you ask most people, what's a layer style, they would say, well, like drop shadow, bevel, emboss, which is true. but it also includes blend mode, opacity, blend if sliders. All of those things are contained in the layer style panel. So if I go back to this one and say, that kind of cool look that I have here, I'd like that on my other layer. So I'm going to go in here and choose copy layer style and go to this layer and choose paste layer style. And you'll see it's already done. I didn't have to go in and redo it. Now I can still tweak it, because when you do paste a layer style like that, it's just saying apply it for now, but it's still a layer style, so I could still double click on it and go in and say, well, maybe I need to tweak this a little further, or lower the opacity, or change the blend mode, or whatever it is. So like when we talked about presets before that I said there's kind of a starting point, this is the same way. So if you have multiple layers that you want to at least start looking the same way, copy and paste layer style, again, means a lot more than simply take the drop shadow and move it, or take the emboss or whatever it is. It's all the things in the layers panel, including blend modes and opacity and advanced blending, etc., etc. So back to this story. Let me step backwards here, since I can't multiple undo yet, but soon. If I wanted to be able to apply that layer style, like that green overlay, instead of going to each layer and doing it separately, this would be a case where I would probably take these layers and put them in a group. So you can select them all, press Command or Control G, it puts them in a group, which looks suspiciously like a folder, but it's called a group. And now if I go to my layer style and do like that colored overlay, you'll see it's doing them all at once. Now there are benefits to doing this, not the least of which is if I decide to change it. When you copy and paste a layer style, like I did the first time, each style is independent. So if I want to change to a different color of green, I would have to do it on all 4 layers. Because I put them in a group, now any change I make here will be global. And it's basically a group layer style, meaning if I add anything to the group, and let's just do this, and I'll fill it with some other color, it automatically takes on the color of the group. It's actually filled with white, but because the layer style is applied to the group, anything I add to the group automatically takes on that style. So if you're experimenting with multiple layers and you want to make sure that everything is affected the same way, this is a case where a group makes a lot of sense, because it's very simple to go in and just, if you add something into that group, it automatically takes on that layer style. If you decide later on you don't want it to have that layer style, you just drag it out of the group and then it won't. It'll have the original color. Okay? So group layer styles is a really interesting way to be able to do all that kind of stuff very simply and easily. Okay. So I talked earlier about using adjustment layers as opposed to regular adjustments. Here's kind of a twist that's happened in the last couple of versions of Photoshop that's kind of interesting. If I wanted to make multiple adjustments, so let's just say I was going to do, I don't know, maybe vibrance first. So let me start again. I want to first make a selection of my sky, because I want to initially start off just in here. So I'm going to just make a really quick selection. It's not terribly accurate, but for our demonstration purposes only, it will be fine. So I go into vibrance and I saturate the sky. And then I need to load the selection again, so I want to make another adjustment layer like photo filter and add maybe a warming filter on it. And then one more time, load. I'm just pressing Command or Control, by the way, to load that as a selection. And actually, let me pretend I forgot to do that. And let's do curves. It's affecting the whole photograph. Here's another example of that Option or Alt modifier. I already have the mask. I forgot to do it there, so I hold down Option or Alt and drag on top and says, would you like to replace it? Yes, I would. So this works fine, but here's the only challenge to having done it this way, is if I'm doing all this work and then I realize maybe my mask isn't quite right, I missed a bit, I'd have to go onto each one of those 3 adjustment layers and adjust the mask, because they're completely independent of each other. So that's okay, but here's where there's another choice that's recent that's pretty interesting. So I'm going to take my background layer, convert to a smart object, and then make my selection as I did before. But now, that menu that I previously called don't ever use this, now it's called it's okay to use this because you made a smart object first. So now I can go in and say I want to do vibrance. And photo filter was another one I did, I think. And I can't remember, curves, I think, was the other one, right? So curves. But take a look at what's happening. It's acting like a smart filter. So there's one mask. This is where it's beneficial. There's only one mask for all the smart filters because now the adjustments are actually being applied as filters, which means they share one mask instead of having to do 3 separate ones. So the advantage of doing it this way is if you're working on something and you know I need to mask a particular area and I want to make sure that if I need to change my mind, I can apply one mask. You can still edit all of these because when you double click, it still goes back to the same dialog box. So what it's done is it's taken those adjustments that I previously said don't ever use and making a one particular example where it's actually beneficial to use them because you're able to make multiple adjustments with one mask. Okay? So this is why I only semi-jokingly said about the answer to every Photoshop question is it depends. When someone says, would you use adjustment layers or smart filter adjustments like this? My answer would be, well, it depends. If they're going to share the same mask, then I do it this way. If I want to mask independently per each adjustment layer, then I'd have them each as a separate adjustment layer. Okay. I'm just using my keyboard to close and don't save. And let's go back here and get this one. So another example that I talked about before is the phrase end up with. I'll show you a couple of different examples in this case. First of all, I'll just add a new layer. So let's say for some design that I'm making, I want to end up with a series of boxes, just like a design element, evenly spread across the page. And I'll tell you right up front, I am terrible at math. So I have no idea. I'm going to just make one box, fill it with this color, and deselect it. Now I want to make a bunch of them. I have no idea how many, so I'm not going to say, well, the document is this many pixels divided by, that's just too much work. So instead, what I do is I'm going to use free transform with a little twist. And there's a key that I hold down when I use free transform. Anyone guess what that key might be? The make better key, yes indeed. Command Option T or Control Alt T. What that does is it makes free transform a copy. So now I'm going to drag and say I want the maybe, I don't know, this far, I think. And I hit Enter. So now I've got 2 boxes. Now I want to continue doing that. In other programs, like InDesign, there are things called step and repeat. Technically, this is not called that, but this is what it does. It's actually called repeat transform, but it says whatever you just did, do it again. So what I did was I moved a copy that much. I have no idea how much that is, and I don't care because it did it automatically. So now I press Command Option Shift T. Each time I do it, it makes another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. Oh gosh, it didn't quite line it up perfectly. That's unfortunate. That's exactly what I would say if that happened in real life. I'd be like, darn it all. I hate when that happens. So, but here's what I did. It was very important that I deselected the first square because it made a separate layer for each one. Now, that might seem like, why would you want to do that? Because it's making all this clutter. Here's why. Because now I can go back to the very first one and say, let's move that out there. Now, take all of these box layers, select them all, take the Move tool, and then distribute them by their centers. So I've ended up with what I wanted, but instead of doing it in a way there, if it didn't work, I'd have to undo and start again. I just said, get them on there. Now that they're there, they're evenly spread out. Now I have a couple of choices. I could either put them in a group, or make a smart object, or merge them. No, I would make a smart object because just the little voice in my head is saying, if I merge them, what if someone came back and said, oh, can you make the boxes smaller and add a couple more? And I'd have to start again. Now that they're a smart object, I can. So what's kind of interesting about this technique is you can use it for anything you're doing. So I'm going to go in here and choose Select Subject. which, by the way, is much faster in this new version of Photoshop. And then let's duplicate it onto its own layer. Then press Command-Option-T to do that free transform. I'm going to pull it down here and make it just a little bigger, like that, and then make some more money. So it's anything you do. If you rotate a copy, then you'll be making a copy that's rotated. If you move it this far, it'll move it that far. If you copy it that far and rotate it, you just have to think about that process of duplicating or copying, whatever it is. Once you do it once, then the keyboard shortcut, Command-Option-Shift-T, Control-Alt-Shift-T, will say, whatever you just did, do it again. And I suggest that as much as possible you do, though, like I did in these cases, on separate layers so that I can still look at it and tweak and adjust, and then eventually save as a JPEG, whatever I want, but I'm always going to try to keep that PSD master version as much as I possibly can. Okay? All right. We're just about out of time, so I will first of all just remind you, if you've probably seen this before, but there is a survey thing on the Max app, so if you fill it in, you get a chance to win a book or a Wacom tablet, which is very cool. I'm going to pack up my stuff in a few minutes, so if anyone has any questions. I also have little cards about my training site. If you didn't get this information before, this is the information to get the free course on smart objects, which was done about a year and a half ago, maybe a couple years ago, but the information is still relevant. If anyone has any questions, come on up and ask them. Otherwise, I thank you very much for your attention this morning. Appreciate it.